it is my judgment that the election of Ahmadinejad is a bad news for the world. He's too extremist. Although all of them are ayatollahs, it's better to have more moderate ones than the most extremist version. And I think that these genuine expressions of the wishes of the Iranian people to see a more open, more just, more democratic Iran is something that the whole world should be taken into account.
Since the election, they have seen repression, clampdown, violence, and that contrast goes quite against the sort of spirit that we wanted to engage with. And I think now there are big questions being asked within Iran about how they are governed. From our point of view, we deplore the violence, but we remain committed to engagement as the means to an end.
A government that treats its own citizens with that kind of ruthlessness and violence, and that cannot deal with peaceful protesters who are trying to have their voices heard in a equally peaceful way, I think has moved outside of universal norms, international norms that are important to uphold. And Chancellor Merkel and I share the belief that what's happened in Iran is unacceptable when it comes to violence against its own citizens, and we call on the Iranian government to uphold those international principles.
Well, those were just 3 reactions from world leaders over Iran's presidential elections. Comments like that, Iran says amount to interfering and violating sovereignty. The international political aftermath of Iran's vote has been as eventful as the happenings inside the country. Today, on Post-Election Iran, our special coverage here on Press TV, we'll be discussing the reasons for this. We are joined in the studio by Timothy Towell, President of the Foreign Policy Group, joining us from Washington, Toufic Machnouk, Associate Director of the Institute for Policy Research and Development, joining us from London, and Franklin Lamb, joining us from Beirut, international lawyer. Thank you to all of you for being with us today here on Press TV. Mr. Towell, I'd like to start with you. The day after the results of Iran's presidential elections were announced, US Vice President Joe Biden said, and I quote here, "I have doubts but withhold comment." What were the foundations for America and some other European countries to doubt the election results so quickly?
I was not involved in that decision-making process. I am retired now, but I've been an election observer many years in many countries, and there are various different standards and qualities of elections, and certain people said there were certain problems. In fact, the government itself said there were certain problems with the election. So there must have been certain problems with the election.
No, that's not good enough.
Was that Franklin Lamb coming in there to comment? I didn't quite...
Well, my first reaction is from our colleague in Washington. That's not good enough. The fact that somebody raised some questions. We have to ask, as was asked in the American campaign some years ago, where's the beef? In this case, where's the evidence that there was some sort of fraud? The fact that the media took this and ran with it is not good enough. I spent 13 hours in Lebanon's election as an observer on June 7th. There were some doubts, same kind of doubts that happened in Iran. Some places closed early. Some people ran out of ballots. There were long lines. There was a little confusion. But that's not fraud. In order to make this case, which still hasn't been made, there's got to be evidence. And it's not good enough to say that there were some questions raised. There's huge stakes, foreign policy, and the future possibly of the Middle East as a reaction to some of this. And I think the standard, and to paraphrase President Obama, the universal norms is that you've got to have substantive, probative, relevant information. And we still don't have that. In fact, the evidence is that there was no fraud. Or if there was, where's the evidence? They apparently are counting 10% of the ballots. They didn't count 10% here in Metienne where there were questions, or in 2000 when Bush stole the election in Florida and Gore got 500,000 more votes. There wasn't that kind of focus there. So I think this process has been politicized. I think the media ran with it, and neutral observers, quote unquote, ran with it without getting the facts. And we don't have the facts yet.
Let's cross over to London and Toufic Machnouk, who might be able to shed some light on that. And also your take on what has just been said.
Well, the first thing is, as the previous speaker said about the facts, that as we and many people now are aware of, 3 weeks prior to the election, a poll was undertaken in Iran, an international poll, an independent poll, that was funded by the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, that found that Ahmadinejad had a 2-to-1 lead to his closest opponent, and that the biggest supporting bloc, age group, for Ahmadinejad was the age group between 18 and 24, contrary to what the media is trying to portray, that Mr. Moussawi has the supporters of the youth. And this election result is not very different from the election result that Ahmadinejad had in the previous election. So it's very consistent with the polls that were taken. In fact, the polls showed that he had a greater lead than the final result in the election. And it's not inconsistent with what took place previous to this. So I think the allegations of fraud are still to be substantiated, and the fact of the matter is there's evidence to show to the contrary.
Well, let's move forward from those first few days now to the latest that we have today. That's Friday. Mr. Towell, the G8, has come out and made a statement. They fell short. They refrained from calling into question the polling results because there seems to be some differences of opinion, but still condemning Iran for some of the post-election violence that has taken place.
That's the key point. I don't disagree with my 2 other colleagues about the elections. We're on television, so I'm not going to criticize the international press. That would be rude. But the thing that is upset, I was in Europe when all this went on, and I just got back last night. The thing that is upsetting the American people and my observation of Europe and the European press is not so much elections that are imperfect, elections that are flawed, but the visions of people in the street being attacked, being shot at. I had the shocking view of that poor young girl that bled on the streets. I don't know who shot at her from the roof, but it's very damaging to Iran. That's very damaging. Iran is Persia. We all remember the Persian Empire and the great Darius. That's a great civilization. It's not a small banana republic. And to have behavior like that in a great capital of the world is disappointing for people who would like to move forward for a more peaceful, constructive world.
Well, it was also disappointing. It was also disappointing what happened in Britain when a police officer also managed to kill a protester here in Britain. Yes. I think the situation in Iran is a very delicate one. Iran is unique in the world in that it has another nation, namely the United States, which this week last year approved $400 million in Congress, very openly. For covert operations in Iran to destabilize the government. Now, you've seen photos of the protests, and so have we, and what's going on is unfortunate. But at the same time, you have a state here, a nation here, that has a terrorist organization that operates in that nation, namely the MKO. And I wonder, how would the U.S. behave?